about Frederick Copleston, given his strategic significance for this place, in terms of he's the one amongst many people, but who makes this place move from the countryside to the city. So Gwen's taught this morning of the monastery to the, what was it, the pub, what was it called?
Tavern.
The tavern. In a way, Freddie Copleston is the one who moves it from the monastery to the tavern. And given we're telling the story of this place, it seemed to be useful to do history through a kind of philosophical biography. So I wanted to say a little bit about Frederick Copleston. As I say, he's the first principal of the newly constituted college, which is this place, in 1970 until 1974. And the way I'd like to come at him is through asking a question, really, which is a question I've sort of borrowed from John Haldane's article he's written on the Jesuit contribution to philosophy in 2016. And the question is really, what's the religious purpose of doing the history of philosophy? If a Jesuit priest spends most of his working life teaching the history of philosophy, what's the point of it? Is there a religious point to it? That's the question that John Haldane asks, and I think it's a very interesting question that allows us to think together. Do interrupt me on the way if there's anything that sounds a bit dodgy or iffy, which is completely wrong, about what this place has meant for many people over the years, and the emotion I think that's around is part of that, it meaning things to people that are important. So the question of what is the religious purpose of teaching the history of philosophy, I think, is a good one to come at understanding this place. Why would you bother doing philosophy in a Jesuit-inspired, funded, shaped college? Because there are many Christian traditions who think philosophy is the devil's work. Literally, you would not find it on the standard Anglican formation training syllabus of ordinands. For example, why would you do philosophy to train to do religion? Isn't philosophy anti-religion, a la St. Paul? The Greeks do this, we don't do philosophy, we have the Christ. So it's not self-evident to be teaching Nietzsche or Heidegger or whoever else you want to name as a religious purpose. So what's Frederick Copleston about, giving his whole life to that? I think in order to get a sense of the answer to that question, or the answer I'm on at the moment, is you need to look into the tradition of humanism in the Renaissance period. I'm no expert on that. The people in this room are more expert than me on that, but I think it's in that sort of package we get at least sensible possibilities to answer the question of what's the religious purpose of doing philosophy. The Jesuit Order is founded in what is called the Renaissance, and it is a form of Christian humanism that shapes what the Jesuit Order will do and how it will understand what it does. And this place is a workshop, effectively, of the Jesuit Order. So in order to understand the meaning of this place, I think we need to understand the tools in that workshop. What is being made in this workshop then, if that's what the religious objective is to this place? And its teaching of, yes, theology, that's kind of easy. That seems to go with religion. You think, right, okay, I can get that. But for a lot of Christian traditions, the philosophy is kind of, that's got nothing to do with religion. That's hubris. It's pride, isn't it? The Christian humanist reading of that, within which the Jesuit order situates its self-understanding, sees philosophy as one of the dimensions, and let's call it human culture, in the broadest meaning of that term, which would be the webs of meaning we spin around ourselves to make sense of life, culture in that sense. Those webs of meaning we spin around ourselves to understand ourself in relation to the world, ourself in the relationship to God, ourself in the relationship to others in societies. Those places within culture are also places within which God is to be found. In other words, God is not only found in action, God is found at all levels of reality. Back to Fiona. Not an easy one. Is it one, is it two? Well, it's both and it's neither. You know, for Aquinas, God is an id quod est, that which is, and esse, being itself. That's the traditional understanding of God. So anything that is grounded in God, somehow. And that somehow is why there's a lot of work to do to rethink what the somehow means in different epoch, using different frameworks of understanding. The Christian humanism born in the Renaissance shapes the Jesuit answer to that question. So figures like Salutati, Petrarch, and especially Ficino, the Platonist priest, polymath thinker, shape a lot of the Ignatian way of thinking about these issues. Even the imaginative contemplation stuff from the exercises. There's a good chance a lot of that comes from Ficino's work. Certainly Gabriel Bryan's book on Plato in Spain and so on has argued that. So the question of Renaissance humanism, I think, is central to understanding why do philosophy in this sort of a place. The answer we've got to at the moment is you do it because God is to be found in it. And the objective of the Jesuit order is to find God in all things, including philosophy. And philosophy as a dimension of culture which spins webs of meaning around our lives is a natural place within which to find God in our cultural productions. So that would, I think, be a first answer of why spend 40 years writing on the history of philosophy, the 9-volume history of philosophy of Freddie Copleston, is, I think, trying to find God in the history of thought or the history of philosophy, the history of ideas. But what does that mean? How do you find God in an idea? Well, how do you find God in anything? Why do we privilege ethics as the place in which you find God? It seems more tangible, doesn't it, to be charitable or compassionate. But can you find God in arithmetic as much as you can in charity? If God truly is being itself in all its manifestations, well, why should you find God more in charity than in mathematics? Is mathematics another form of charity, fundamentally? is there some intrinsic connection between what Aquinas calls the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful, at the ontological level of reality. That just means the structure of reality. In other words, when you hit the truth of your quadratic equation, to a certain extent, you hit the justice button and you hit the beauty button all together. It's like a sort of pinball machine. They all go off. There's a sort of intrinsic interrelationship between truth, goodness, and beauty. If God is to be found in all things. So philosophy, no less than, let's say, charitable work with the homeless, or celebrating the Eucharist, or paintings, and so on. All those aspects of society and culture have in some way God as their ground. The metaphor to use might not be appropriate in ground. It could be their sort of interconnection or lattice. But some way of thinking about the nature of reality as being permeated, to use a kind of Hopkinsian way of thinking, you know, the bubbling up metaphors, kind of volcano type metaphors, is a way of saying, well, all these aspects of, including culture, have God in them, and not in a spatio-temporal in sense, more in an ontological sense of in or through. So if that's the case, then what Freddie Copleston is doing in the 9 volumes is a kind of extended, what in Jesuit speak is called the examen, which is a reading of a period of time to see where God was in it, where we put our foot in it, how we might do it better in the future. So clearly God's in it and God's not in it, and knowing the difference allows us to move in the right direction. I think why Freddie Copleston writes the work is to do that kind of spiritual exercise, a kind of Pierre Hadot sense, of philosophy as a way of life, to read the history of philosophy as a site where God is present, and the negative is present, whatever you want to call the bad spirit in the spiritual exercises sense, evil. So the history of philosophy for Freddie Copleston is a kind of philosophical discernment of spirits. This is how Copleston puts it in volume 7 of the History of Philosophy, page 441. It is a dialectical movement, the recurrence of certain fundamental tendencies and attitudes in different historical shapes. So a dialectical movement, in other words, good spirit, bad spirit, in spiritual exercises jargon, the recurrence of certain fundamental tendencies and attitudes, the transcendentals of Thomas, the recurrence of them in different patterns, and attitudes in contexts or historical shapes. And towards the retirement side of his life, Freddie started to look at philosophy in India and philosophy outside of the Western tradition and so on, as was becoming to be more and more an option at that time. So there's a sense in which this is an ongoing project. I'm sure if he was alive today, he'd be doing philosophy in China and India and, you know, all sorts of things, gender and so on, trans You know, where is God in all of those cultural, as you were saying, Ursula, dynamics, the process nature of human culture and society, which is what you would expect from a history of philosophy, which is by its nature processual. It goes on and on and on. So that would be my sort of just throw out there answer to the question, what's the religious purpose of doing it? It's to discern in philosophy as one of the departments of human culture God and evil in all these manifestations of our human creativity that we call thought. So I'll stop there. We've got 10 minutes for discussion questions, yes?